All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, September 2012, a video is bouncing around political circles upending the 2012 election. This video, which had sort of leaked a few days earlier, shows Republican presidential nominee Mitt Romney telling supporters that, quote, there are 47% of the people who will vote for the president, referring to Obama, no matter what, because they are, quote, dependent upon government, believe that they are victims, believe the government has a responsibility to care for them. These are people who pay no income tax. These comments, and especially that little phrase in the middle there, the 47%, became a touchstone in the home stretch of the election, especially because it folded into a bigger theme of the election, which was, the economic recovery and how the American economy is structured. Remember Barack Obama's line about "you didn't build that"? They were kind of played off each other. So let's talk about Romney's 47%, why it went so viral, and what it signals about modern conservatism. And on that last point in particular, we are very excited to be joined by special guest David Korn, D.C. Bureau Chief for Mother Jones, which is the progressive magazine, and author of the new book, American Psychosis, a historical investigation of how the Republican Party went crazy. In it, he writes about this moment. David, welcome to the show and congrats on the new book.
Thank you so much. It's great to be with you.
And in having you on, I'm realizing that we haven't done an episode on Mother Jones, and so put it on the list. We're going to do an episode about Mother Jones.
Put it on the list,
yes. Not the magazine, but the activist at some point. We will get to that. But with us, as always, are Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
And Niki's new book, as people know, is Partisans, also an investigation of modern conservatism. So it'll be really great to have the two of you kind of compare notes and research as we go on in this conversation. But first, let's get to the kind of 47% comments themselves. David, I kind of maybe buried the lead. Did you break this story? Did Mother Jones break this story?
I did. I found the video through a lot of hard work that led up to this. I mean, there's a whole long backstory to how it came about. I don't know if you want to get into that, but I broke the video.
I want to know who gave you the video.
Yeah.
It's now known for the first, when the story came out, and for months afterwards, it was a secret. But eventually the source outed himself. It was a bartender who had worked at the fundraiser. It was in someone's home in Florida, who had taken a video of Mitt Romney. He was a fellow who, was I think of a Democratic liberal pro-union bent, and he just kind of thought it was neat. He was working an event that Mitt Romney was speaking at. It was private. And as he was serving drinks from the makeshift bar, he had, remember when we used to have cameras rather than phones, cameras? He had a camera that also took video. So he just literally put it on the bar next to a plant. It wasn't like out in the open, but also it wasn't like totally hidden. And he just pushed start when Mitt Romney started talking. So he really didn't quite know what he would get from this, and he, got the 47% remark, and Mitt Romney talking about other things, including a trip he took to China and his attitudes about Israel, which in private were different than what he was saying publicly. And he had put out a few clips anonymously online, not the 47% clip, but one about Romney discussing a trip he took to China, in which he seemed oblivious to sort of the conditions at the work camps that companies had set up in China. He was like, gee whiz, look at these great happy workers. And the bartender thought, well, wait a second, it's not quite forced labor, but it's also, not, freedom either.
Right.
So he put that out. And because I was writing a series of pieces throughout the campaign about Romney investing in companies that were doing business overseas in Mexico, China, taking jobs from American companies, I saw this video, and it was, I can't remember, 30 seconds long, about Romney talking about China. And I couldn't tell if there was more to it than these 30 seconds. So I spent a couple of weeks trying to find online who had posted this video so that I could, find out more about Romney in China. And I finally made contact with an anonymous account that was behind the video, and finally convinced that person after weeks to send me the full video. And he said there's some other things on it that might be of interest to you.
One or two other things.
Nuggets.
And I said, okay. And then and so when I got it, I looked at the China stuff, and there was really nothing more there than what he had put out. And I said, shoot. But then I listened to the whole thing. And when I got to the 47% portion, which is 45 minutes into the hour-long tape, I said, whoa. I paused it, and I called everyone in my office about my reporter. I'm the DC bureau chief from Mother Jones magazine. I had about 10, 15 people working for me. I said, everyone come in the office. Why don't you just listen to something, watch something, and give me your reaction? And I didn't want to prejudice them in any way. So then I played it, and everyone looked at each other and said, oh shit. and when you described the tape at the beginning, you left that one line that came after the portion you quoted, in which he says, these people will never take responsibility for their own lives, and it's not my job to worry about them or work for them. And I think that to me was the most dismissive part of the whole thing. Not that they were 47% of the people who don't pay taxes and they're freeloaders. That's pretty insulting. But then to say they don't take responsibility for their own lives, half of America. And so, yes, everybody had the same reaction that I had. So that was my focus group. And then we turned out that most of America had that same reaction too when we published the tape, posted it a few days later.
It's so interesting because there's another line in there too that says something to the effect of they think that they're entitled to healthcare and food and housing. And I think a lot of people are listening along being like, yeah, people are entitled to food. It's a good thing. But it fed into some of the darker notes of the 2012 campaign with people like Newt Gingrich dismissing Barack Obama as the food stamp president. And I feel like it exposed a kind of crueler side to Romney that he had managed to distance himself from with his sort of aw shucks persona.
Well, just also the idea that this is said at a private dinner party. We just did the episode about Hillary Clinton and what she said at, I think, a private fundraiser. But the things that people say when they think that they are among friends or they think they're among like-minded people, they're a little less cautious. They're a little bit more cavalier about some of the things that they throw out there. I I mean, I don't know. I would have also wanted to see like how were people nodding in the room that were in the room when he said this? Like, do you have a read on how people responded at that moment?
Romney was playing to the crowd. This was I don't think we called it this at the time, but there was a conservative meme, or what we used to call theme, at the time, which is there were makers and takers.
Yeah.
Right. That's what they called it. The makers were the people who went out there and created businesses and ran corporate America and made wealth, and the takers were all those other people who wanted food stamps and they wanted free health care. They wanted all these social programs, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. They're taking from the people who are making. And it is true that, 40%, between 40 and 50% of Americans, working Americans, often don't pay income taxes because they don't make enough money to pay income taxes. But they pay state income taxes, they pay Social Security taxes, they pay, of course, sales tax, or if they own property tax. They do pay a lot of taxes. But if you don't make a certain amount of money, you don't end up paying federal taxes. So there was this whole conservative movement that, to do something about this, which basically means making poor people pay more taxes, that everyone should pay some taxes, even if it's a little, and that there are people out there who are just skating by while the rest of us are working hard and, and having our money taken from us. And so what Mitt Romney was trying to do when he was talking to this private dinner party of very wealthy people in Florida at a mansion, right? He was trying to riff on that conservative theme. The 47% figure was probably like the number of Americans who don't pay federal income taxes.
Yeah.
But he expanded it to like, they don't do anything. They just want to get, not that they're just not paying taxes, but they just want us to provide food and healthcare and housing for them. And of course, the Obama campaign against Mitt Romney, the essence of it was, he was an out of touch plutocrat who was involved in a predatory capitalistic business, Bain and Company, that would, sometimes take over companies and downsize them and fired people. I mean, they also created some companies that created jobs like Staples, but as I was reporting, they were investing in companies overseas that were taking jobs from Americans. So he was a predatory capitalist. Even Newt Gingrich once called him a vulture capitalist, and that he was out of touch with Americans, middle income Americans, low income Americans, and didn't care about them. And, I know people who know Mitt Romney, and as a person, they describe him as being someone who does care about his neighbors and the people who work for him, and he's kind and generous and has a warm heart. But here he was, in this private meeting, playing completely to type.
So I think you're exactly right about kind of how he takes that 47% figure, which comes from the Tax Policy Center and is about, federal income taxes. And he goes one step and he sort of then elides that and generalizes to, now we have half of Americans who would just, want to take in that way you described. But then he also takes it even a step further, which I think he takes it and kind of makes a political analysis out of it, because he says, and that 47% will never vote for me. They're always going to vote for Obama because he's giving them giveaways or whatever. And, to me, I think that ties into this large lesson of just like, don't psychoanalyze your opponent's supporters. Don't generalize about them. Don't do political. Don't do political punditry if you are a candidate. But I feel like that was another layer that was really big on top of this as well, that he was making this political analysis and, to your point, writing off a whole group of voters.
And I think the headline we put on the story was something like "Secret Video Shows What Mitt Romney Really Thinks About Obama Voters."
Right.
To your point. I mean, he was denigrating half of America and saying this is the half of America that's voting for Obama. And, it's hard to sort of sometimes separate this out, but it strikes me also that there's a bit of a racial component here.
Absolutely.
Half of Americans are shiftless and irresponsible, and they're with the black guy. I mean,
Yeah,
he
yeah.
didn't say that those are not his
But the
his
dog
words.
whistle is clear. It's clear
Yeah,
who
but
he's talking about.
yeah, and there, and the whole conservative project for decades prior to this, which I go into my get into my in my new book, American Psychosis, was sort of on the Republican side was based on exploiting, racism and racial resentment, that the Democrats were the party that were giving away stuff to black people, and white people should be upset about that. That's how Ronald Reagan got elected governor first in California in 1966. So that's a very strong undercurrent to these remarks here.
Someone correct me, was it Rick Santorum who was like, we don't want to give it to blah people? Like he like sort of caught himself midway through. Like
the whistle was falling out of his mouth.
But it was this idea of like not poor. He was talking about poor people, but really he was talking about black people. But there's this whole narrative, an old narrative really, that talks about not just the poor is undeserving, but anything black related is also undeserving as well, or lazy, shiftless. These are old ideas, and yet they constantly get recirculated and recycled again and again with different synonyms attached to it to make it seem like, well, I'm not talking specifically about black people or even poor people, but that's the whole idea is there.
Yeah, it's a remaking of the welfare queen trope from the early Reagan eras. It hits all the same notes. And not only does it have that undercurrent, almost a overcurrent of racism, but it's also just bad analysis. Like the people that he's talking about it as takers, a few of them don't work, but many of them are a part of the working poor or the working lower class. And a lot of them are the elderly who spent their entire lives working and who are retired or who are working part-time at that stage in their lives. So it also just doesn't hold up as a piece of analysis about what the country looks like.
But also when he says that they won't take responsibility for their lives, it's very hard to get by in America on social welfare programs. So it was, it sort of indicates, again, this sort of like plutocratic, vision of the world, that there are poor people out there who are just sitting on their soft cushions, enjoying life on the backs of us makers.
Yeah.
It's
and
easy.
Also the idea
food stamps, easy street. Right?
The federal government has no responsibility. The federal government has no reason to help out, to that's not my job. That's not our job. Which, begs the question, okay, well then what is the role of the federal government then?
No, I mean, but I think exactly to that point, I think that this tied into, what I felt covering the race at the time was actually sort of a substantive difference between Barack Obama and Mitt Romney, represented by this 47% comment, and then, as I referenced, Obama's comments of "you didn't build that." And so those were the two memes, and I don't like memes and the talking points, but I actually felt like, in real time and looking back, well, actually there's a real sort of fundamental difference here about the role of government being articulated. And so, David, I'm curious, if you can flesh that out. And I'll just say Obama's comments were kind of like he was talking to someone who'd built a small business, and the person was saying, I built this. And he kind of said, well, you didn't build that. You had a lot of help along the way. You probably got some tax breaks. You probably got programs that helped you, et cetera, et cetera. Just kind of pointing out that the American economy is.
You were talking about the infrastructure. If you have a business, you need highways, right? You need transportation hubs. You need the internet, as you would say now. And so when he said you didn't build that, he didn't mean you didn't build your own business. Right. He meant you didn't build this infrastructure and the surrounding. You need cops to make sure no one robs your warehouse, or if something happens, you need the fire department. So it was like you didn't build the environment in which your business has thrived. And so, the right-wing media pounced on him and tried to make it sound as if he was denigrating the business owner for not having been.
But as articulations of the role of government, these two lines.
Yes. Well, Obama had given several major speeches throughout the campaign about how the role of government was to help create the right environment for business, but also to police the excesses of capitalism and try to make sure that as the economy grows and develops, the benefits are spread out more evenly. Of course, the traditional Republican view was, government should keep out of all this, except by giving tax breaks and lowering environmental regulations. And we don't have to really, as Romney said, don't have to worry too much about taking care of the losers in the economy. Mm-hmm. And so there were two very distinct views of the economy and the political economy in the 2012 election. And I think each side, had a pretty good advocate. But we should also talk about what happened after the video came out, because people may not fully remember this. These days, the news cycle feels like what Dorothy said in The Wizard of Oz. People come and go so quickly here. A big story comes out, and we chew it up online within 20 minutes. And then by the next day, you almost forget about it. And so the FBI raid on Trump feels like it was 3 years ago now, right? When it was just a couple of weeks. So things really get processed and mashed up real quick. And that was true back in 2012 as well. The news cycle was, almost a half a day. Sometimes you have several news cycles a day, particularly during a campaign. And so the story came out, I believe it was like a Monday afternoon, and maybe Tuesday, and it had a great impact. It was all over news that night, and the story stayed in the news for almost 2 weeks. Whoa. Which was unheard of at the time. And one reason that was at first Romney couldn't deny it because it was on tape. This is what the type of story that a journalist like myself loves. It's not based on sources. You can't say it didn't happen. You had it. And to your point earlier, Kellie, we went behind the scenes. We showed people something that they never get to see. And at first, Romney and his allies, claimed his remarks were taken out of context, which was kind of stupid because you had the tape. You had that tape. It was like Access Hollywood. There's the tape. This is what you said. And then they kind of like tried to explain what he really meant in terms of the 47% tax policy, blah, 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 blah. And they kept flooding the response. And then he semi-apologized, and that wasn't good enough. And then he finally apologized. But this whole process took about 9-10 days. So, and it was largely a self-inflicted error. And the reason why this is, important, and not just that his ineptitude was amusing, is that people at the time and since then have tried to figure out if the 47% video, won the election for Obama, cost the election for Romney, if it was decisive. And polling data in terms of looking who supported Obama and Romney at what points in time is like often inconclusive. But what I have always thought is that the most valuable resource in a campaign, in addition to money, is time. Mitt Romney had about 11 weeks after he got the nomination in the general election to make his case to the public. And when you do that, presidential campaigns often create, you can imagine the big calendar in which they, this week we're going to do economy, this week foreign policy, this week how Obama is killing the nation, this week we're going to do family stuff. You come up with a strategic plan that is actually a schedule, a calendar. And he lost up to 2 weeks on this, so you think about opportunity cost, which is really hard to measure in terms of a hard and fast metric. But whatever he wanted to do to advance his campaign for those 10, 12 days after the tape came out, he could not do. He got kind of pinned down and basically lost 2 weeks' time to make his case.
But it persisted longer than that in a sense of, Kellie, tell David your story about Election Day.
Oh, yeah. So at the time I was living in Dorchester in Boston, and I went to go vote. And as we're standing in line, it was a long line. And there's a black man standing behind me, and he's like, the 47% is here. The 47% is here to vote. Oh. And I was like, oh, it's not going well for you, honey. It is not. And people were sort of like, yeah, you know, pumping their fists or whatever. And it was actually kind of exciting to see. But like,
wow, that's a great story. I've never heard.
Yeah.
I've never heard that. I've never heard anyone put it that way too. No, I think the 47% idea stuck. Right. But eventually the campaign media coverage moved on to other things. But, you know, but that idea stuck to a lot of people as your fellow Dorchestian.
You go into the ballot box. Yeah, you go into the ballot box thinking about, you know, what matters to you or how a candidate thinks of you. I think what's really scary is that, you know, those sentiments become policy. Those sentiments become, you know, legislative acts that have detrimental consequences for how we view. I think of how those ideas would have filtered out in a pandemic moment, you know, when we're facing high levels of poverty and unemployment. That 47% comment would have, you know, it would have ended everything for Romney at that time.
NIki,
But, you know, it's interesting because when Trump was running for in 2016, I believe it was during the campaign before he was elected. I have to go back and look this up. He said essentially the same thing as the 47% remark. He said half of America isn't paying taxes and they're just living off the rest of us. So, you know, it wasn't, you know, word for word, but it was the exact same sentiment. And you know how people noticed that or cared about that? Zero. I mean, I wrote about it, so I noticed it. But by the time he was running, you know, the Overton window had so shifted that, you know, when he's basically calling for, you know, keeping Muslims out and, you know, playing 20 different dog whistles at once, you know, the fact that he too said that half of America were freeloaders, you know, ended up on the scale of Trumpian outrage, didn't even move the needle.
That's crazy.
Right? So,
that's crazy.
Yeah, no,
it's crazy because there's so many other plates spinning.
Exactly.
And thinking about that Overton window idea, I was just trying to think through, you know, Jody was talking about how you have the 47% versus the you didn't build that as two different visions of government and government ideology. I wonder, David, how you think about that and the shift that's happening in terms of anti-government extremism and what you write about in your book, this idea of the Republican Party going crazy. Is it a party going crazy? Is it a party just going more extreme? How do you think about the broader shifts that are happening in the conservative movement over the course of your book and where this fits in?
Yeah. Well, the point of my book is really to show that Trump is not an aberration. He is a continuation, a culmination of a long-term Republican practice and tradition, which was to encourage and exploit far-right extremism. And that includes paranoia, conspiracy theories, tribalism, and racism over the years, and hatred as well, and divisiveness. So, you know, I mean, I kind of, you know, I go back to the Salem witch trials, but I really start with McCarthyism in the 1950s and just show how the Republican Party was generating a bat crap crazy idea that the Democrats in charge of the government at the time, this is what Joe McCarthy argued, were literally part of a conspiracy to undermine the United States so that the Soviet Union could take it over. It wasn't that their policies were wrong and they were, you know, weakening the country and giving the Soviets an advantage in terms of positioning. No, they were purposely doing this. They were an internal subversive enemy. And that resonated with millions of Americans who had, you know, the Cold War jitters and, you know, they were experiencing nuclear terror for the first time, that, you know, we could be, you know, blown up in a moment's notice. And so the Republicans then, over the course of the decades, you know, play that game with the Birchers, and then with white supremacists and segregationists with Nixon and the Southern strategy. You have Reagan embracing the new right and the religious right when they're claiming that gay people want to kill Americans. I mean, literally want to kill Americans, and that homosexuality was a crime. Some of them said this, not all, that could be punishable by death. Some moral majority leaders were saying this, and Reagan was embracing the moral majority. And, and then the same thing with the Christian Coalition and George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush. And you go up to the Tea Party, and Sarah Palin, I skipped over her, but we just go to the Tea Party where they say, that Obama is a secret socialist Muslim who has a secret plan to destroy the American economy so he can impose a totalitarian state. And you had Glenn Beck, Tea Party leader, on Fox News saying that Barack Obama had plans for concentration camps and death panels. So he was either going to kill you or lock you up. And people believed this. I mean, this is just complete nuttiness. There's obviously a racial component to it, and it's divisive. And Rush Limbaugh had led to this as well by pushing all sorts of conspiracy theories. So the conservative movement, the Republican Party base, had become more and more, I think, extreme in its views towards Democrats, liberals, the black guy who was president. And the Republican Party completely honored this and saw this as a way to energize its voters and win elections. And this all just kind of leads to Trumpism. As the Republican Party throws more and more red meat to its base over the last 30 years, they want bloodier and bloodier, morsels. And Donald Trump comes along and says, yeah, I'm here. There's no one bloodier than me. And, even Mitt Romney, when he ran for president in 2012, he embraced Donald Trump when Donald Trump was a chief birther, the leader of the birther movement, which, was racist, conspiracy theory. There was nothing to it, but it was resonating with the base that, basically Obama was not really a legitimate president because he wasn't born here. The black guy's not a real American president. And, and Romney, who, is a gentleman, would never say anything like that publicly. I'm sure he doesn't believe that nonsense, but he took Donald Trump's endorsement, literally hugged him at an event. And what is that doing? That's conveying legitimacy upon Donald Trump and the whole conspiratorial racist approach to politics that he was banking on. And I think historians have been loath to focus on this and see this as an ongoing and important story over the last 7 decades.
NIki, you want to jump in on that since that's so much of what you've been writing about?
So I do think that this is something that it has taken historians until maybe the last 10 years or so to say, oh, we've been buying into this idea of responsible Republicans and responsible conservatism and not charting the persistence of some of these darker ideas and the way that not just the party and the movement have partnered with extremism and extremists, but the way that ideas like the 47%, like an anti-government ideology, were born out of opposition to federal help for Black people, federal support, and in many cases in the early 19th century for Indigenous people, trying to protect them against white settlers. There's a great book after listeners go out and buy David's book. In a couple of months, there's a book coming out by Jeff Cowie that looks at how deeply rooted anti-statism is in this kind of extremism and whiteness. So yeah, there's this deep, deep history. And then there's a moment, in my book, I place it in the 1990s, but there are these moments where the party just doubles down on thinning the walls between the mainstream Republican Party and extremism. And now those walls don't really exist.
So, you know how booksellers do that? If you liked this book, you could buy this book and bundle them together type thing. So go get David's book. Hopefully NIki's pops up and hopefully vice versa, right? But I mean, these two books really speak to each other and they work well. And we'll also have that third author you mentioned, NIki, on. David, as we wrap up, I do want to come back to this 47% moment in a sort of media landscape question, because as I was looking into this, I remembered that there were a couple very sort of the time responses to this when this tape leaked. So one, there was a whole news cycle. Who doesn't love to argue about decorum, but the whole news cycle about whether it was appropriate to leak a tape secretly recorded at a fundraiser, and that became a whole thing. And then also there was 2012 was the height of fact-checking journalism, and the truthometer was going crazy, and people were taking this 47% and digging in and being well, it's actually 46% according to this region, and missing, I would say, the forest that Romney was describing for the fact-checking trees, but that was a very sort of, that was a fad at the moment. And so I'm just curious, kind of remembering back, whether you felt like people actually engaged with what really was going on in this tape.
Yeah, I think they did. I think part of the power was that most people, even Republicans, when they saw this, they realized it was the wrong thing to say. The Romney campaign knew, the Obama campaign knew, and everybody else watching knew that this was a BFD, as Joe Biden would say.
Yeah.
But from my mind, I mean, as when I talked about my response when I first saw it. I mean, I thought it was a big story. I underestimated how big played. I mean, I thought this is good. People see this. I got a good scoop. Maybe I get an award or something, whatever. But this is what journalists live for.
I'm not getting invited to any fundraisers, but
That's right.
I know, right?
Yeah, it really became, I think, a defining moment. It's crystal clear in journalism. We strive to tell the truth and show the truth. And when you can do it in a crystal clear, unambiguous way, it's always the best. And I think that's why it landed so strongly.
All right. Well, we will leave it there. Thank you so much for, telling that inside story, but also putting it in the larger context that you do so well in your book. The book is American Psychosis, a historical investigation of how the Republican Party went crazy. David Corn, DC Bureau Chief of Mother Jones. Thank you. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
And Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
47% of Americans pay no income tax. So our message of low taxes doesn't connect. And he'll be out there talking about tax cuts for the rich. I mean, that's what they sell every 4 years. And so my job is not to worry about those people. I'll never convince them that they should take personal responsibility and care for their lives. What I have to do is convince the 5 to 10% in the center.
Radiotopia.